Okay, so London, England, a city characterised by its hustle and bustle, expansive green spaces, iconic landmarks, and cultural diversity. Incidentally, despite my accent, it's also the city I was born in. Now, of course, Elle and I were not Londoners. We've actually rarely spent more than a few days in London, but whenever we visited, it's always lived up to its reputation, right? We've always enjoyed it. We've been travelling around Latin America recently, so it's been a while. But if you were to watch certain videos online, you'd be under the impression that London and a lot of cities in Europe are places that are in decline. So we're going to spend a few weeks in the UK's capital to see what, if anything, has changed. So whilst we've been away, I suppose making videos about immigration, the declining state of the West, has become quite a profitable niche for many creators on YouTube. People in Britain, are unhappy, right, with the system, with the government, and they feel ignored. When this happens, many, often led by fraudulent leaders, look for something identifiable, simple, to blame their problems on. And for some, this problem is immigration, or for some, the conclusion is immigration. And this is a pattern as old as time, right? So obviously in 2023, net migration hit extremely high numbers, 900,000 in the UK. And this is high even by historical standards, right? But at the same time, people on boats seeking asylum are also crossing the channel, and this is very newsworthy stories, and it's a good way for papers to sell copies when they're struggling so much at the minute. The thing with asylum seekers, and the reality is they only contribute to about 3 to 4% of all immigration, and we are obliged by the UN to accept some of them. So, the idea that asylum seekers are taking over our country is just factually, empirically incorrect, right? Also, whilst all of this is happening, we're enduring a cost of living crisis, and immigration is quite a simplistic answer and reason to give, right? So, I'm not some left-wing political ideologue, right? A lot of people are. A lot of people want to say, immigration is perfect, it's always great, there's nothing wrong with it, and other people want to say it's bad and all the evils of the world are to do with it, and I think both sides of this fence are pretty stupid. If you've got some problems with immigration, you're not automatically a bigot, in my opinion. Mass immigration can lead to things like housing pressure, wage competition. There can be issues with social cohesion. So I understand these issues, but it is important to address the facts, especially with these YouTube videos going around. So immigration in the UK spiked after labour shortages during COVID, right? We essentially needed immigration rapidly for health and social care, for our economy, for hospitality, for research industries, after a huge kind of labour shortage during this period. Many of the current immigration pool are also students, right? Who pay these extortionate fees so that our homegrown students can go to university for free in my country, Scotland, right? Or at a capped rate for the rest of the country. So these immigrants that make up quite a big bulk of the numbers, are literally helping, us educate our own people. Brexit, of course, also, which was all about taking back control, means that employers now look for workers outside of the EU, right? Because it's harder to get workers inside the EU, or it's at least just as easy to go further afield. So, we need this immigration right now for the country to literally function, and that's just a reality, unfortunately, if you are on that side of the equation. Now, I think something that the left tends to fail to acknowledge is that there is a chronic kind of skills gap in our workforce, and there has been for decades, right? And since deindustrialization, basically, there's been weak local labour markets for years, and in theory we could reduce the kind of necessity for immigrants, which there is a necessity right now, if we invested more in things like education, training, technology, innovation, right? If you look at doctors, for example, we need to import doctors because the government has historically not trained enough of them for our needs. And maybe a way to combat this would be to make medical school more attractive in this country, less expensive, allow people to get on the course rather than having these very exclusive entrance exams and entrance interviews. It's if you hit this grades, then you get into medical school, so we can produce more of our own doctors. But ultimately, we don't do that, and there is a shortage of doctors, nurses, and people in these positions, which means that we do need to bring in immigrants, right? So all of these issues actually aren't anything to do with immigrants themselves or immigration. The problem is with government investment, planning, and these kind of things. But that kind of lengthy, boring explanation doesn't engage people in the same way, and it isn't catchy enough or clickable enough for these grifters on YouTube to monetize their now increasingly horrible content. And that's essentially it, right? It's much easier to blame it on an immigrant or take photos of like a metro sign or a subway sign in a different language and, you know, generate uproar than it is to talk about like the economic failures of, you know, 3 decades. So that's the truth of it, sadly. So immigration has become this kind of topical issue, especially on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and all this kind of stuff. But it's always existed, right? It's not some new phenomenon. Because of the current spotlight, certain YouTubers who, you know, never went near the subject before are starting to make content about it, right? My guess is because it's making them money. So you can call me a cynic, but I'm convinced, you know, these YouTubers aren't doing it out of a passion for, you know, British immigration, considering like one of them I'm going to talk about is South African and the other 2 I believe are Irish and German maybe. So take these 2 geniuses, right? 2 mad explorers. So I actually watched them a few years ago, strangely, like I'd come across them before. Must have been about 5 years ago now. Me and Ella and I were going to Albania, you know, at that time, a country that, you know, not loads of people went to. They just started opening flight routes up from Scotland. So we flew out there and I watched their videos, very innocent videos about like, you know, the prices and about how, you know, the roads are quite crazy, you know, very innocent, quite normal content, right? Even a little bit dull. And then I'm not someone who tends to watch kind of travel content unless I'm going to the place, so I've not seen them for years, but, you know, they were on pretty modest views. And now they've been on a streak of releasing content about like immigration, this Muslimhood in London, you know, the migrant crisis of Greece, you know, acting like they're some kind of like hard-hitting investigative journalists. And you'll see that their view count and probably their income has changed a lot since they've started doing this. So let's have a look at one of these videos because they're proven successful for them and probably deserve some little bit of scrutiny. So here's one of 2 mad explorers' many wacky, crazy videos. So they're staying in London, Whitechapel. You know, worth noting that they highlight the predominant religion in this area, okay? You know, they act like they sort of booked here by accident, but, you know, I don't really buy that if they're putting Muslimhood in the title of the video. I think they probably did this on purpose. But anyway, here we go.
Hello everybody and welcome to our mouldy hellhole of an accommodation here in central London. Well, we're actually in the East End, the old East End of London in Tower Hamlets, which is one of the most dangerous areas to be in London. We didn't realise that, unfortunately, until we booked this place. But today we're going to show you...
Okay, so straight off the bat, they came here, they didn't know where they were coming. Okay, these people are professional travellers, right? They literally make money to travel. I find it quite difficult to believe that they would just come to London, one of the most popular and most highly visited places in the whole world, and not know where they're staying, okay, and just stay somewhere with a high Muslim demographic by accident. Okay, call me a cynic. This isn't really to do with immigration, but, you know, they're either liars or idiots.
This is where we're staying, £75 a night. You have a shared kitchen, which is basically entirely made of black mold.
Okay, so entirely made of black mold. Again, I would normally be too pedantic on this, but given what they go on to claim in the remainder of this video and their other videos, I would like to see some more evidence of this said black mold because, yeah, I don't trust their word. Anyway, for 2 mad travellers or 2 travellers who do this professionally, they seem quite dumbfounded that a room in one of the most expensive and one of the most visited cities in the entire world with some of the most famous sites in the world costs £75 for a night. You know, that seems pretty normal to me. If you go to expensive parts of the world with high populations where a lot of bankers and things like this live, then it's going to be more expensive, right? I think the guy's from Dublin, he's definitely from Ireland. The exact same thing happens in Dublin. You pay a lot more than you would for a room in a Latin American country, for example.
Wow, 75 Great British pounds per night for this. It's basically a box room.
So again, I thought these well-travelled people would understand kind of basic economics. There's a lot of demand in London, so it costs more. Same with everything in London, right? Or Paris, or Dublin, or New York.
But let's go outside. Let's go out to the streets of London and see. Expectations are not very high, to be honest.
Now, in preparation of leaving the house in London, you want to remove all jewellery, everything that you love and hold dearly to yourself. Hide it away and make sure to close all of your bags.
I mean, this is just outrageous, right? So he already admits his expectations are low, right? Which, you know, suggests that their narrative for this video is kind of already set. Again, really putting into question their claim that they didn't know where they were coming. She's talking about how she needs to like hide all her jewelry and like hide her necklace, and she's showing like the, you know, her Christian necklace or whatever to kind of highlight her fear, right? They're just going to go out into a city during the day and everything's going to be fine, right? But they're acting like they're, you know, walking down the Gaza Strip or something.
Timeline of events. We're very, very likely going to post the actual protest first. But this now is our very first day in London, and let me tell you something, I am terrified to be here.
She's already claiming that it's like more dangerous or extremely dangerous, more so than any other place that they've been, like when all they've done is see a fucking squirrel. But the impression they seem to have of London when nothing's happened yet is insane, right? And just to show you the kind of people they're appealing to, I just want to take a look at this comment here. A country taken over without a shot being fired, referring to immigrants coming. You know, immigration has taken place and happened in the UK and in most countries for hundreds and thousands of years. Just because a demographic of an area changes, that does not mean it's being taken over. And I don't really know what the shots fired thing is to insinuate that we should have a war because we bring immigrants over to work in our health service. But, you know, as you can see, they've liked this comment, so, you know, I think it's pretty clear what person and what demographic, what group of society they're trying to appeal to with this video.
We made it to Whitechapel. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, man. Out of every 20 people that we walk past, maybe 2 of them are actually English. It's a bit of a shock. We saw videos online about how bad the situation is here in London, but I didn't realise like the actual extent.
Okay, so they talk about how bad things have got, right? So basically implying that because only 2 in 20 people appear to them, by their eye, British or English, then it's a really bad kind of situation. So, you know, I'd be really curious to know how they're kind of crunching these numbers and how they're carrying out this survey, right? So like if a Bengali person here moved in the 60s and has had, you know, kids, and then their kids have had kids, and they see them walking around Whitechapel, does that mean they're not English because of their skin colour? You know, if someone was born in England, grew up in England, and their parents were the same, they might be ethnically Bengali, right, but they're still English.
Now, if you go to Delhi, you want to see Indian culture. If you go to Shanghai, you want to see Chinese culture. If you go to England, at least in London, from a tourist perspective, it's quite difficult to find people of English ethnicity, and I'm saying this really quietly.
Okay, so that's why she's saying stuff quietly, right? Because she's saying kind of borderline offensive stuff out on the street. But like, oh look, that's interesting. There's a white person in the background there. She looks pretty English to me. But it's not difficult to find people of English ethnicity in London, right? It is if you go and stay in Whitechapel, an area known for housing Bengali people. I'm staying in Wandsworth right now, Hammersmith, you know, many other areas in London. If you go there, you'll see loads of people who are ethnically English, whatever that means. So yeah, the idea that, you know, it's difficult to find out is ridiculous, right? English in Wales, as of the 2021 census, is about 74% white British, okay? Again, I'm not sure how they're deducting whether someone's British or English or not. Is it their skin colour? Because if that's the case, there's plenty other white immigrants as well that would appear English just by looking at them, right? Like Irish, Romanian, Polish, in places like Hammersmith and Kilburn and things like this. So again, I'm not really sure what they're getting at there, but of course, if you go and stay in an area known for housing Bengali immigrants, then you're going to see less British people, less white British people than you would in another area. Seems pretty obvious to me, and the same applies in many cities around the world. If you go and stay in an area known for housing them, East Harlem in New York, for example, a lot of like Puerto Ricans, okay? Elephant and Castle here in London, you meet a lot of like Colombians and Bolivians, okay? There's areas with huge Chinese and Japanese populations in Lima in Peru, okay? Same with Argentina, although a lot of those immigrants were white, so people seem to have less problems with it.
So that's the the language that's being used in England now. I always thought it was English, coming from Ireland where we used to speak Irish and now we speak English.
I've never seen
Changed.
this. I've never seen this in Europe. This is insane.
Okay, so they're dumbfounded at what looks like Bengali. I assume it's Bengali because they're in Whitechapel. What looks like Bengali being used on signs. Okay, so obviously a huge Bengali population, there has been for years. What's natural with immigration is once one generation moves over and settle, then it's obviously natural for the kind of next wave of immigrants who come to England to settle in a similar area because there's people of a similar background to them and they can assimilate and integrate into society more easily, right? Basic stuff. Obviously, a lot of people who come over, their English won't be particularly strong. You know, at the start, they might not have great English literacy. Maybe they can speak it, but they can't read it. The same might apply to older people who've been there for years and years, okay? And the signage helps them integrate, right? It helps the economy because they're more likely to use the underground, go and try and find work, go and buy stuff, spend money, right? Because they can use the underground, okay? So I guess what two mad explorers are inferring is that they shouldn't have any alternative language on the signs to help people get around the city and make stuff more accessible, to help safety and to include people and to maybe help tourists who come over there because, let's be honest, if there's going to be any Bengali tourists, they're probably going to stay in Whitechapel given the demographic. Very strange, you know. I'm sure that when two mad explorers were in China getting the train to Tibet or in Laos or in Vietnam, they just read the signs in Vietnamese and Chinese the whole time. I'm sure they probably read them in English, right? Because it helped them get around, okay? London's no different, so being so dumbfounded by a sign introduced to make it more accessible for people who live in the area is just insanity. You know, I didn't know they spoke this language here now. They obviously speak English, and I thought someone from Ireland would have more caringness and more knowledge around how immigrants are treated, considering, you know, less than 100 years ago there were signs around parts of London saying no Irish can work here, no Irish allowed in here. I thought he might be slightly more sympathetic.
And now, without one single bullet being fired, it feels like it's a very, very changed city, I can tell you that much. The area where we're staying doesn't feel like you're in England. The areas that we're in now, it's a little bit more touristy. You can see the vast majority of people that we come across are American tourists or tourists from other parts of the world. It's a sad state of affairs, and to be able to be here and see the names of these people who died defending this country, it's just quite sad.
I understand where the commenter got their verbiage now from, right? Because they're talking about a shot not being fired, right? So again, immigration's happened across thousands of years, right? Irish people came over, Nordic people came over, Romans came over, right? And they, you know, infiltrate and, you know, make Britain or England less ethnically British or English, right? And that just happens over time. He talks about how it's very different from when they were there before, but they've never been to Whitechapel, right? Or they would have known that Whitechapel was somewhere with a lot of Bengali, as it has been for decades. And the signs and the irritation with like how people look and things like this, right? This is kind of all what I was referring to at the start of the video, okay? So some people are going to get maybe annoyed or a little bit offended with immigration, right? Because they think they're coming over and taking our jobs, stuff like this, right? And the real issue is that we need them to do our jobs because of poor economic planning over the course of decades, because we don't train enough of our own doctors and nurses, right? So after coronavirus, after these huge labour shortages, we needed a lot of unskilled workers, if you want to call them that, people who work jobs that don't require maybe like a high level degree. We needed a lot of them to come and do our jobs. You know, if their point is that, you know, they don't want or they don't think that, you know, the UK or London should have immigrants doing all their jobs and we should have these jobs for our own people, then like, I don't agree, but I can at least understand where they're coming from. But getting annoyed with a Bengali sign or with like the apparent, non-English demographic in a certain area. It's sort of like, getting annoyed at the fire alarm instead of the fire, right? The issue already exists, and we need to bring immigrants over to solve that issue. So they're sort of getting irritated by the wrong thing, right? That might not be the best analogy. I don't know, getting annoyed at like the noise of an ambulance rather than the crime that's happened or the injury that's happened. Fuck knows, but likely through their ignorance, they're associating the problem with the immigrants themselves and bringing immigrants over, whereas the issue is that we actually need these immigrants to do the jobs. Okay, so I had enough of Two Mad Explorers now. I just want to jump onto this guy quickly. I'm barely going to look at it just because it's pointless, but I actually used to quite enjoy watching this guy's videos, right? Kurt Kaz. He went to Latin America a lot, and before I'd ever gone, I kind of always had this idea that it was a very dangerous place, and he kind of went to dangerous areas in Latin America and showed that it wasn't that dangerous. Now, given his European content, I'm kind of not overly convinced that he actually did go to any dangerous places. Like, I'm like, did he maybe just walk around a street, someone warned him a little bit about getting robbed, and he sort of acted like he was in the hood? Because, I got people many times when I was in South America said, you're going to get robbed here. And I didn't make a video about it acting like I was, Ross Kemp or something. So I'm not really sure. But he's on this kind of far-right anti-immigration grift as well. So I'll take a little look at one thing he says in particular and why it's, a load of shit, and why I think he's probably slightly more egregious and more of a grifter than the other two.
It's a funny thing. We're in central London right now, and there is a gang of drug dealers right over there, selling drugs in the open. There go the police in the background. There go the police. And the drug dealers are right there in London.
So I don't know when Kurt Kaz suddenly became like my fucking granny or something, but I've seen him in videos in northern Colombia on like a speedboat going to an island, like smoking joints. I've seen him and his driver on death road in Bolivia with a llama eating cocoa leaves. The idea that he's somehow got some like huge problem with like drug dealers is just insane. Like there was another video in Lisbon in Portugal where he's like acting like Batman and chasing around drug dealers or, scammers or whatever. So, fair enough. A lot of people think that there probably shouldn't be drug gangs on the street, sort of agree. But, the idea that he's got some kind of like huge moral issue with this seems quite insane, seeing as some of his most popular videos are him consuming drugs.
Oh. Coincidentally, the majority of the people that live here are also of foreign descent. Country or a city is not the architecture or the roads or the infrastructure. No, guys, it's the people. When you replace the people, you lose the country. England is the English. If there's no more English, there's no more England.
Talk a little bit about the hypocrisy and why that's so problematic, right? So basically talking about if immigrants move over, then that is replacing England and making England not England anymore, right? So it's defining the nation ethnically rather than civically, right? Which is literally the definition of ethnonationalism. So, the problem here is that under Kurt's definition, England hasn't been English for centuries because we've had immigration from different parts of the world come to England for centuries, and it's no longer purely English, right? And the irony of a white South African going on about this, under his definition again, he wouldn't be considered African or South African, right? Because I believe he's from German descent. A bunch of white colonizers went over to South Africa to control the wealth and the diamond mines and stuff like that there. He's not South African then. He also went to, Argentina a bunch in Latin America, which is the videos I first found him, the videos that I liked. And, I don't remember him ever pointing a camera on like a white Argentine's face and saying, you're not Argentinian. This isn't true Argentina, because a bunch of Italian, Welsh, French, Portuguese immigrants all moved to Argentina and displaced a lot of the indigenous people. So again, is the argument here that immigration's okay if people have a certain skin colour? Is that kind of what he's getting at? Because I really don't understand it if not. England has not been purely ethnically English for a very long time. And, the idea that people are coming or immigrants are moving here are like the wrong ethnicity and they're replacing the people, okay? It ignores how historical national identities have evolved over millennium. And, you know, English identity has emerged through like Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxon, Vikings, Normans, Jews, Commonwealth migration. Okay, so like, you know, nations are usually historical constructions rather than these fixed ethnic identities. And again, I thought that someone from South Africa, a white South African, would be aware of this. Okay, so unlike other people on YouTube who talk about immigration being a good thing or all positive, we are actually in London, so we're actually going to go to some of these areas which have historically had loads of immigration and currently have loads of immigration. Okay, so we'll go to Whitechapel, like the two mad explorers did. But first, just because of where we are, we're going to visit Brixton. Okay, Brixton, London. So Brixton is a neighbourhood south of the river in London that is closely tied to the story of like modern multicultural Britain. Okay, so after the Second World War, Britain faced huge labour shortages, just like they did after the coronavirus. And large numbers of workers were needed to rebuild the country, especially in things like transport, factories, construction, and the newly created NHS, which I believe was created by the Labour government in 1948. Free healthcare became available, which obviously means more workers were needed, right? And because many Caribbean islands were still part of the British Empire, you know, British imperialism, people from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and elsewhere were basically legally British subjects and could move to Britain freely, right? So the symbolic beginning of this migration came in 1948 when the ship Empire Windrush arrived at Tilbury docks carrying hundreds of Caribbean migrants, okay? And a lot of them settled in Brixton. Although Britain needed the workers at the time for the country to function and for the new NHS to function, okay, as you suspect, many Caribbean migrants experienced racism and discrimination as well, right? There were signs saying no blacks. Incidentally, there was also signs at this time saying no Irish, okay? So, you know, it'd be nice if the guy from Two Mad Explorers remembered that when he was going around pointing at Bengali signs as if they were unnecessary or, you know, as if it was some attack on British identity. But basically, these signs saying no blacks were very common. Okay, many people were pushed into like overcrowded housing. They worked poor jobs or low-paying jobs, despite having qualifications or wartime service records. Right, the area has basically become famous for reggae and like sound system culture. Right, a bunch of famous musicians like AJ Tracey, Big Narsty, Dave, Basement Jacks, even, and obviously loads of famous footballers and sports people. Dillian White, for example, is from Brixton, and like many other footballers who weren't based in Brixton but come from like Jamaican/English heritage have all like contributed to the country in a major way. But now I believe Brixton's, you know, pretty safe, pretty enjoyable area to go. We're going to go there out of convenience because it's very close and because we're hungry. We want to try some Caribbean Jamaican food. There we have it, Empire Windrush.
That is going to be difficult eating.
Is it?
It's on the bone.
How is it?
It's really good, man.
Yeah, really nice sauce.
Hard to
isn't it?
eat, but good.
Yeah.
Look, if you just pick that up and take a bite.
Okay. tell. How was the food?
It was really nice actually. I thought it was going to be pretty disastrous eating, but it was pretty successful.
Yeah, I actually bumped into someone I've known since I was a teenager from Inverness, and he was down on a Jamaican food tour, down for work.
That's not why he was down.
No, he was down for work. I just said that. But quite the coincidence, really strange. Then after we got some food, we met a guy from Colombia. We're speaking to him in Spanish. So it is a Caribbean area, mainly from the British Empire days, but there was like a lot of Spanish being spoken, I heard as well. And then we went to Brixton Market and we had a beer in a place called Hence as well. £6.50 a pint. Not the worst.
It wasn't. No, I expected worse.
It was a good beer. They had a DJ on and stuff.
Yeah, it was quite like a swanky place, I'd say. So
Kind of we hipster joint. It was their own beer as well. It was a really nice beer.
Yeah, maybe swanky.
Called Hence. So it was good. I was getting really busy just before we left, but we're going to walk to Clapham now. As London expanded south of the Thames River, a barrio or an area called Elephant and Castle became quite popular and became transit and kind of commercial hubs. So it was first settled on by the Jewish community in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A lot of Jewish immigrants kind of settled into this area. The Italian community followed, and then, you know, of course, 20th century post-war rebuilding and global arrivals. So the Windrush era, the similar demographic who settled in Brixton from the Empire Windrush, from like Caribbean communities, a lot of Asian and Chinese communities. And since the kind of 80s and 90s, it's become sort of the UK's Latin capital. Of course, various issues in Chile and Argentina, the kind of dictators and the genocide going on there meant that a lot of Argentines and Chileans settled in this district. There's like the Latin Elephant Advocacy Group, which basically notes that it became like an epicenter for Colombian, Ecuadorian, Brazilian as well. I was there, saw some Peruvian restaurants too, saw a Bolivian restaurant, spoke to a Bolivian, spoke to a Colombian, had an empanada from a Colombian bakery where it tasted, you know, identical to one you would get on the streets of Medellin. And yeah, had a really good time there, spoke some Spanish. And it's really difficult for me to see why places like this, with immigration, character, multiculturalism, why these are bad things, right? I had a lot of fun there. Hola, ¿cómo te va? Bien. Una empanada de carne.
No hay carne.
¿De dónde sois?
Yo soy Bolivia, ellos son colombianos, la cita de
Colombia.
Colombia.
Con efectivo, ¿está bien? Colombia. ¿Dónde en
no,
Colombia?
es que no.
¿Dónde en Colombia? No.
En Medellín.
En Medellín, un paisa, ¿no?
No recibimos ese billete.
Ok, no, todo bien.
Ok, thank you.
Gracias, thank you. Hasta luego, un gusto. Okay, so today we're going to go to Wimbledon, of course, area of London known for its massive tennis tournament every summer, and, you know, obviously somewhere in London that feels very different from somewhere like Brixton or Whitechapel. Okay, the streets are much quieter, wealthier, more suburban. It's also, though, one of the more international parts of outer London or suburban London, right? Around 40% of people in the wider borough of Merton were born outside of the UK, which is an incredibly high number. By British standards, right? You know, it was originally this kind of small village and then it expanded because of the railways, and over the 20th century it's, you know, developed and has quite a global identity, right? You know, whilst London became this kind of financial and cultural centre, Wimbledon attracted foreign professionals, right? Business people, diplomats, wealthy international families from across Europe, Asia, the Middle East and beyond. There's loads of like international schools, cafes, a lot of South Africans, right? And, you know, you can feel that when you're in the area, you notice it, okay? But despite how kind of international Wimbledon is, you know, immigration here isn't discussed or referred to as a kind of major social problem or as an area being taken over, right? Like kind of poorer areas are, okay? So it's kind of this interesting contrast, I suppose, you know, because a lot of concerns people raise around immigration in Britain, pressure on housing, like overcrowding, rapid change, could also apply to Wimbledon. But, you know, people don't complain about it as much there. You know, it's usually framed as more of like a cosmopolitan, like desirable area. You know, a big part of, I guess, why immigration, you know, isn't seen as a negative thing in these richer areas is obviously because maybe the people there don't notice the pressures that immigration put on, you know, like a very busy tube or busy schools like they do in more local areas or poorer areas, you know, in places like Brixton where they take on like, you know, loads and loads of immigrants straight away. But it is interesting how, you know, they're perceived differently, or they even have different names, right? You know, wealthy immigrant is often referred to as an expat, where, you know, the reverse, they're referred to as an immigrant. So it is interesting, and obviously none of these YouTube channels that try and sensationalize the immigration problem ever go to the kind of posh areas with immigration where there's loads of wealthy immigrants living there as well, right? They're always filming kind of poorer areas and, you know, trying to insinuate that immigration is the problem with these poorer areas, which, you know, probably isn't the case. But anyway, we'll go to Wimbledon for some contrast. Obviously, you know, both kinds of immigration are useful and successful for Britain, okay? But, you know, post-coronavirus, as I mentioned before, there was intense labour shortages, just like there was after the World War II when the Windrush generation came, which means that, like, we need low-skill workers, if you want to call them that, people who do kind of everyday normal jobs, just as much as we need the high-skill ones. Welcome to Wimbledon, the birthplace of the strawberry. No, Andy Murray's Scottish. Birthplace of the tennis racket, the strawberry, and Pimm's.
Did you know that tennis comes from Wimbledon?
The word tennis comes from Wimbledon. Sound it out. Tennis, Wimbledon. So that's why tennis started here with the racket and the strawberry in Wimbledon.
Did you know the first
it started when they were hitting
match was played
the strawberry
here
with a tennis ball
in 1832.
Right, we're here in Wimbledon. I am shitting myself. There's 40% immigrants here. And as you can see, it's all kicking off, mate. We're trying to keep the heads down as the only two white people in this whole vicinity. Okay, good afternoon. So yesterday I was in Whitechapel, the east end of London, in searing heat. Okay, so it's been the hottest 2 days in London in May ever the past 2 days, getting up to about 35 degrees. But I went to Whitechapel nonetheless as we leave soon. I can't believe, or I'm in disbelief at the exaggeration of these influencers, right? Two mad explorers. It felt absolutely fine. I thought it was going to feel like a little bit dangerous or something, given their warnings and their hiding of their jewellery and things like this. It was absolutely fine. Very pleasant place. Very busy, of course. A lot of different cultures. Okay, so Whitechapel's this area in London's East End near Tower Hamlets. It's known for immigration across centuries, right? First it was the Irish, then a lot of Jewish people came over in the 1880s. Around the same time, they were fleeing persecution in Europe and they went to Palestine as well. So much so that eventually in 1905, a thing was introduced called the Aliens Act to basically stop mass immigration, right? And incidentally, that's why they ended up, or the British ended up creating a national home in Palestine. Anyway, you know, that's by the by, maybe for a video another day. In 1970s and 80s, a major wave of immigration came from South Asia, predominantly from the Sylhet region of Bangladesh, right? And this kind of transformed the area as settlers found work in textiles and catering, okay? Today, Whitechapel's known as the heart of London's Bangladeshi community, okay? Brick Lane, for example, has got all these famous curry houses, a lot of South Asian heritage, sitting next to the East London Mosque, which I visited. Very nice building, nothing threatening about it, just people going in to pray. I went into the Whitechapel Gallery as well, free entry, which was, you know, a very, you know, welcome gift on that hot of a day. Nice, cool gallery with some art and works relating to Whitechapel and some from further afield. I went to the town hall as well. Bustling Whitechapel market, loads of like street vendors. Very cool, fun. Felt like being back in like Latin America or something, which, you know, I just don't see as a bad thing. Also, it's not like purely Bengali or whatever, right? I saw the signs, of course, because there's a huge community there, but I saw like Lebanese food stands, Turkish food stands. I saw a good couple of old British pubs one of the pubs actually had carling on tap. I went in to check. So, you know, maybe we should actually promote immigration more and, you know, free London of carling and the horrific beer it is. So still some British stuff, saw plenty of white people, saw plenty of other people, and yeah, I wasn't going around doing as thorough a survey as two mad explorers, but very pleasant place, and I'll definitely be back when it's not 35 degrees. Okay, to summarise, you'll be glad to know. So, of course, over the past 100 years, immigration to the UK has increased dramatically, right? Britain went from a country with a relatively small foreign-born population to one where now roughly 18% of people today were born overseas. And obviously in London, that is especially noticeable, right? You hear different languages, you see different religions, different types of foods, and different sorts of communities, right? And whether people see this as a positive, negative, or kind of how I see it, just as something inevitable that's going to happen, depends on their politics, values, all this stuff, right? But pretending it hasn't changed is basically just detached from reality. So of course it's changed, okay? And I suppose, like, why did this happen, right? Well, a big reason is the economic reasons, right? So Britain is a relatively small country, right? Population of like 70-ish million, right? But we function as a major global economy. We have the NHS, right? Social care, hospitality, construction, logistics, universities, transport, all of these sectors have faced labour shortages at different points. And at the same time, birth rates are declining, population's ageing, and the economy becomes increasingly reliant on service sector work, right? So immigration has become part of the solution after world wars, after coronavirus, and after various other big events, right? So it's not like some conspiracy theory, right? It's basically just that Britain needed workers, consumers, taxpayers, students, and economic growth, and immigrants and immigration has been leveraged or used by the Labour government and by the Conservative government to solve these problems. Now, obviously, depending on where you live, this can cause like real pressure and issues, right? So we went to Wimbledon, for example, where there's a lot of immigration, and not as many issues faced by people because of condensed population, whereas places like Brixton and Whitechapel, you know, housing gets tighter, infrastructure struggles more, right? Like the underground, the tube, there's more or longer waiting lists with your GP. Some schools might become overcrowded. In some places, like, communities can change very quickly and rapidly, and you don't, you know, recognise the place. For example, you know, a certain part of Glasgow or London feels very different culturally than what it used to when you were younger, right? Reasonable people on the left would admit that basically Britain has often handled like integration and long-term planning when it comes to immigration in a poor way, in a bad way, right? And a lot of the frustration people feel is less about immigration existing itself and more about the speed, scale of the change, integration planning, and these things, right? So, you know, some people on the left are going to disagree with that, and some people on the right are going to say that all immigration is bad. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, you know, and that's why it's quite an irritating discussion to have, because people play identity politics with it. The issue with online content and the YouTube videos that I kind of reviewed is that the analysis becomes like zooming in on Bengali metro signs or filming like random like brown people walking down the street, or acting like, you know, hearing another language means that like Britain has been taken over or invaded, right? And this isn't serious political discussion, no matter how much these YouTubers like Kirkaz and Two Mad Explorers try and paint themselves as like investigative journalists, right? A Bengali sign in East London is not the reason houses cost 700k. Someone's skin colour is not the reason why wages are stagnant. And a family speaking fucking Urdu outside a chicken shop is not shaping like housing policy, right? The reason this content exists and the reason a lot of them have pivoted to this is because outrage sells, right? The algorithm rewards anger because people comment and get annoyed. Fear gets clicks. So these creators clearly understand that leaning into demographic kind of anxiety taps into a growing online political movement. That's why Kirkaz doesn't talk about immigration when it comes to Latin America. He talks about dangerous and, you know, hoods and, you know, cartels, because that gets clicks. And he knows that, you know, outrageous, salacious content about immigrants and about Europe being taken over gets content when it comes to European videos. even if Farage and Reform or any kind of political party like that got into power in Britain, they would still have to rely initially on immigration, right? You know, their argument would be that take something like a care worker, we increase those wages enough so that British people want to do that job and we don't have to import people, meaning that we don't have to rely on immigrants to do that job. But of course, this can't be done straight away. You'd have to accept some kind of like lower or slower economic growth. You'd have to massively expand training and, you know, education when it comes to medical care. You'd have to somehow like improve birth rates, okay? And you'd have to invest heavily in automation, infrastructure, and all these things. So even the most anti-immigrant party, if they were in power, which they're not, which I'm thankful for, and I think they're thankful for as well, even they wouldn't be completely against any kind of immigration or say immigration is all bad, right? The question is less about, you know, is immigration bad or good, but it's like how much immigration should we have, what type, and how quickly, right? What level is sustainable? Can infrastructure keep up? Should Britain rely less on imported labour? Should we train more of our own in certain industries? All of these are genuine political questions, and I wish the discourse revolved around that rather than about ethnicity, shop signs, or whether strangers look like British enough from a German, Irish, and South African. Incidentally, Brixton, Whitechapel, and Elephant and Castle, all places with a lot of immigration from maybe poorer nations. I enjoyed each place thoroughly, would go back, and I think it adds to London rather than detracts from it.